Great, so now that we've seen how to get an Angular project up and running, the next thing that I want to do is take a closer look at how types add to Angular. Now, we've already seen that Angular components are basically just TypeScript classes, and it's worth mentioning too that TypeScript classes are a little bit more comprehensive than JavaScript classes, right? Just the basic class structure that JavaScript provides. So the first thing that you might notice about Angular components is that the instance variables that they contain are a little bit more robust than instance variables in regular JavaScript classes, right? In other words, they're a little bit easier to define, and all that this initial app component has is an instance variable called title that has this initial value of TypeScript and Angular. And if you take a look at the corresponding HTML file for this component, and by the way, in case you haven't worked with Angular before, you should know that each component in Angular is actually split into 3 different files. The first one is obviously the TypeScript file, which represents all of the data and logic behind a component. And then we have the HTML file, which represents the main structure for our component that gets displayed on the page. And then we have the CSS file for our component, which contains any custom styling that we want to add. So what we're actually going to do here is remove all of the default code that Angular gave us inside this app.component.html file, because basically that's just what got displayed in the browser here, and we don't really need that. So let's delete that, and what we'll do instead is we'll create an h1 heading, and inside of here we'll just say something like welcome to the... And then, in order to insert the value of an instance variable from a component into the HTML, we can just say double curly braces and the name of the instance variable, right? So we could say welcome to the title app, and that will take the value of the title instance variable and automatically insert that into the HTML for us. Right, so as you can see, TypeScript instance variables are really a core part of how we're able to insert values into Angular components, right? So if we wanted to add another instance variable here, and we'll call it something like name. All right, we'll say name equals, and then I'm going to use my name here. You should definitely feel free to use your own. If we want to insert that into here, right, so we can just add the person's name at the end here, all we have to do is say name, and if we go back to our browser, and by the way, Angular will automatically refresh the app in the browser whenever we make changes. So if we just go back and take a look at our app in the browser, sure enough, it says, welcome to the TypeScript and Angular app, Sean. All right? So the nice thing about Angular 2 is that because of the way it's set up behind the scenes, whenever the value of one of the instance variables changes, it will automatically be reflected in the component's HTML, right? So if we were to change this title or change this name, then it would automatically show up that way on the page. And we can actually see this by adding a simple constructor to our app component. And inside that constructor, all we're going to do is we're going to say set timeout. All right, so this just executes a piece of code after a certain amount of time. And what we'll do is inside of here, we'll say this dot title equals, and we'll change the title to something else. So we'll say new title. All right. Cool, so now that we've done that, let's just set that timeout for 1 second. And now if we save this and go back to our app, what we should see is if we hit refresh, after a second, boom, it'll change to new title. So that's a really nice thing that Angular does for us. All right, so that's one of the big pieces of functionality that libraries like Angular or React or Vue take care of for us, is making sure that what the user is seeing in the browser is representative of what the data is behind the scene. And that's actually not as trivial a thing as it might sound, right? There's actually a lot of different logic that has to go into making sure the user interface is kept up to date with the data behind the scenes. But anyway, another thing that I wanted to show you here is how inputs in Angular components work. And inputs are basically just the Angular version of what would be called props in React. They're basically arguments, so to speak, that we can pass into components from the parent component. So if we wanted to create a new Angular component, which by the way, you can do just by running ng generate component, and the short version of that is nggc if you don't want to type out the full words there. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create a new component, and we'll call this something like message. And if we hit enter, that will create 4 new files for us. So we see that that creates a corresponding TypeScript, HTML, and CSS file, as well as this test file. So that's sort of the 4th file that usually goes along with Angular components, but we're not going to take a look at that right now. And now that we've created that new component, we should see that the files have appeared in this message folder. So if we take a look at the TypeScript file for this message component, what we're going to see is that unlike the app component, this message component automatically implements this onInit interface. Now again, this is just another way that TypeScript really helps us structure our Angular applications, because by implementing this onInit interface, that's how we make sure that this ng-onInit method in our message component gets called when a component is initialized. So in other words, through the use of TypeScript interfaces, we're able to actually change the functionality of our Angular components. But getting back to what I was saying about inputs in Angular components, here's how TypeScript can really help us keep our inputs straight. And first of all, we're going to need to import this input thing from the Angular core package up at the top. So now let's say that we want to allow the parent component of this message component, right? In other words, whatever component happens to be displaying this component inside its HTML. Let's say that we want to allow the parent component to pass in the name that this message component will display. Well, all that we need to do there is say @input. And by the way, this might look a little bit strange to you. This is just something called a decorator, and all that that does is it allows us to add extra functionality to an existing class or instance variable. And in fact, you've probably noticed by now that all of the Angular components have this component decorator that is in charge of defining certain metadata for our components and making sure that Angular knows what to do with them. So anyway though, let's just define an input which we'll call name. Well, what TypeScript will allow us to do is specify the exact type that these inputs have to contain. So in other words, if we want this name input to be a string, then we can just use the TypeScript string type here to make sure that the parent component passes in a string. Now, you'll notice here that we have this little red underline that says the property name has no initializer, and that's just complaining because if the parent component happens to not pass, this name input, then the value for it could be undefined. So we can fix that either by adding a backup value for this input, right? And that's the same way that we assign an initial value to any kind of instance variable. Or we could just change the type slightly so that possible for this name input to be undefined. And in any case, what this will do is it'll make sure that the types for this input match up down the road. So, if we want to do something with this name input, like if we want to convert it all to uppercase, then what that might look like is we'll say this.name equals, and then this.name.to uppercase. However, what you'll see is that my IDE has automatically added this little question mark thing after this.name. And if we remove that, then TypeScript is actually going to give us an error saying that this object is possibly undefined. So this is, again, just an instance of TypeScript making sure that we don't get some unwanted error when, say, the parent component doesn't pass in this name input, right? Because if we were to call this.name.to uppercase and this.name is undefined, that's going to cause a JavaScript error, and that could cause our app to crash. So TypeScript will take care of warning us about situations like this. And really, this is just another instance of how useful TypeScript can be in larger applications. So let's just add that question mark thing back. And this, by the way, isn't something that's specific to TypeScript. This question mark notation is something that's available in more recent versions of JavaScript. Basically, it just prevents errors that result from trying to call a method or access a property that doesn't exist on some object. All right, so this will basically make it so that instead of crashing, this.name is just undefined. So anyway, let's just remove this, and what we'll do instead is we're just going to display this name property inside our message HTML file. So let's open that up, and what we'll do is we'll remove this and we'll say hello, and we'll insert the name input. And let's just go back to our component here and force this to be a string. And we can also provide a default value just to make sure that name is not undefined. So now if we go back to our app component and display our message component, what that's going to look like is we can just open up the app component HTML, and instead of this h1 heading, we can just display our message component by saying app message. And now if we save this and go back to our browser, what we'll see is if we hit refresh, oops, our app isn't running, so let's try running our application again with ngserve and -- open as the flag that will automatically open that up in our browser. What we see now is that it says hello and there is no name because our app component hasn't passed. So now all we need to do is add name equals Sean here. And if we save this and go back, we see that sure enough, the name shows up and is displayed by the child component. All right, so hopefully what you've seen here has just given you a basic idea of how TypeScript works in an Angular application and why TypeScript is such a vital part of the Angular library. So anyway, that's how to use TypeScript and Angular together.